Okay, just going to give it one more second. Just let everyone hop on and we'll get started. Okay, it's 1 minute past 12 o'clock. Good afternoon to you all. We are so excited to welcome you to Boston Children's Hospital COVID-19 Vaccines, Answers for Families. We're really glad you could join us today. My name is Kristen Dattoli, and I'm the Director of Enterprise Communications here at Boston Children's Hospital. And I am so pleased to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing and for sharing. We are also streaming live on Facebook, and we also know you have a lot of questions, and we're going to do our best to get to all of them today. But if we can't, please don't worry. We will continue to answer all of your questions across our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so you can go ahead and keep checking back frequently with us. If you do have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box. And at the end of the webinar, we will share our COVID-19 hotline number with you, our website information, so you can go ahead and bookmark that as your go-to resource for all things COVID, vaccines, and of course, overall kids' health and wellness. So let's get started. We are so lucky to have with us today Dr. Kristin Moffitt to guide our discussion. Dr. Moffitt, can you just take a quick moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kristen. I'm Kristin Moffitt. I am a physician here at Boston Children's Hospital in infectious diseases. I also do a fair amount of research in infectious diseases on both bacterial infections, and I've been doing some COVID-related research as well in terms of pediatric immune responses to COVID infection. So I'm happy to be here today to answer questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So just last week, the Pfizer vaccine has been approved for children ages 5 to 11. So could we just start there and talk a little bit about how does it work and how do we know it's effective? Let's just jump right in and say, this is terrific, 5 to 11, what do we need to know?
Sure. So I will talk about this in terms of what we already knew about this vaccine and how it works, because it is the same vaccine that has been authorized for those 12 and older for quite some time now. It's been approved formally now for those who are 16 and older. So this is an mRNA vaccine. Again, it is the same vaccine that's been used and given to millions, hundreds of millions of people so far across the world. It encodes the mRNA for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Once the vaccine is given, the mRNA is delivered into our host cells around the area where the injection occurred, and our own cells make the spike protein and sends it out for our immune cells to recognize and to make an immune response to it. So in that way, it is exactly the same as the vaccine. It's the same mRNA that has been part of the Pfizer vaccine that's been used we're coming up on a year now. The only difference with this vaccine that has been authorized for use in 5 to 11-year-olds is the dose. So 12 and older so far have been authorized or approved to receive 2 30 microgram doses of this vaccine given 3 weeks apart. The only difference here is that the dose for 5 to 11-year-olds is 10 micrograms. So it's 1/3 of the adult and adolescent dose. It is still given as 2 doses, 21 days apart.
Got it. So go right ahead.
I think your next part of the question was about efficacy. So again, because it is the same vaccine that has been used for those 12 and older for quite some time now, we are extrapolating what we might anticipate about its effectiveness from what we know has been its effectiveness in real world settings now so far. What was used to really feel confident about this vaccine's likely effectiveness in 5 to 11-year-olds was what would be called immunobridging studies. So instead of waiting for the 5 to 11-year-olds to be faced with COVID-19 infections and waiting potentially months and months longer to confirm the efficacy of this vaccine, which is how a vaccine performs at reducing infections in a controlled clinical trial setting, the Pfizer was able to do immunobridging. So they measured the antibody responses that 5 to 11-year-olds made as part of this trial and found that those antibody responses that are able to neutralize the SARS-CoV-2 virus were very similar in the 5 to 11-year-olds who received this vaccine, as had been for the 16 to 25-year-olds who'd been part of the Pfizer phase 3 trials for this vaccine. So that response indicated that the immune response was excellent, and therefore the effectiveness of this vaccine at preventing COVID-19 infection is also expected to be very, very robust. We had a few cases of COVID-19 infection, confirmed COVID-19 infection in the 5 to 11-year-olds who did participate in the phase 3 clinical trial. Most of those cases were in the children who received the placebo. Again, it was a small number of cases, but the breakdown on those cases in placebo compared to the patients, the subjects who received the vaccine, ended up yielding a 90% efficacy of this vaccine in 5 to 11-year-olds at preventing COVID-19 infection.
Wow, 90%. That's pretty remarkable. You talked a little bit about the difference in dosing for the 5 to 11. So could you talk a little bit about why is this vaccine based on the age of the child versus the weight of the child? So if, for example, you've got two kids that are, the same age, but one is a whole lot bigger, is there any concern around that child not getting enough protection?
Sure. No, it's a great question because we think of medications, which are so often weight-based, especially in pediatrics, when there's a huge difference between the weight of a 2-year-old, a weight of a 5-year-old, and then the weight of maybe an 11, 12, or 13-year-old. However, actually for vaccines, vaccine doses have almost uniformly always been age-based. I actually can't think of any that have been weight-based. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is practical. When you're thinking about broad implementation of a vaccine rollout, there needs to be an easily identifiable characteristic by which an individual can schedule a vaccine and then practitioners can administer that vaccine. So that's done by age for that reason. But the other reason is immunologic. Unlike medications that tend to be weight-based, the immune response that we are expecting vaccines to be able to generate are actually more closely related to the developmental stage of a person's immune system than it is to their weight. So that's related to their age and not their weight. And I would just tell families that are worried that they have a child who is on one end of the spectrum of either the 12 to 15-year range, and they're a little nervous because maybe they have a much smaller 12-year-old and they'd be more comfortable with the lower dose, or the flip of that, someone with maybe a 10 or 11-year-old who's larger and they worry about whether the 10 microgram dose is enough. There were children of all sizes included in these age bracketed phase 3 trials. And what we know was that the immune responses were excellent, regardless of whether it was a child at one of those extremes of weight based on age. So I think parents can really take reassurance that their child is not going to be shortchanged, for example, by the 5 to 11-year-old dose, and they're not going to be overdosed or getting excessive vaccine for children in the 12 to 15-year age range.
Wonderful. What are some of the basic side effects of the vaccine?
So we learned from the FDA review of the data that led to their authorization of this vaccine in 5 to 11-year-olds that the most common side effect was pain at the injection site. That was actually quite common after both the first or second dose, and that's not unusual for almost any vaccine. And then beyond that, the most common side effects were some fatigue. That was in about a third of the children who received the vaccine, and then some headache, some muscle aches, and then smaller percentages of children had chills. A very small percent, only 6% of children had a fever after the second dose of the vaccine. So those were the most common side effects that were reported. And it's important to note too that in general, the frequency of side effects in the 5 to 11-year-olds was lower than in the 16 to 25-year-olds and the 12 to 15-year-olds who were part of the Pfizer phase 3 trials. Importantly too, there were no cases of anaphylaxis in any of the over 3,000 children, 5 to 11-year-old children who received the vaccine as part of the trial. There were also no cases of the inflammatory condition of the heart referred to as myocarditis. As many people are aware, there are ongoing investigations into a very rare side effect from COVID vaccination that was noted largely in males in the 12 to 29-year-old age range. Again, these were very rare cases, but did seem associated with timing to be related to COVID-19 vaccination. There were no such cases of myocarditis in the over 3,000 5 to 11-year-olds who received this vaccine. It should be important to note, though, that that study did not have the number of participants high enough to necessarily note that as a side effect because it is such a rare side effect. But it would be important for families to understand that and to know what to be aware of after vaccination in terms of any concerning signs.
Terrific. And the same process as well. So the number of doses are 2 and 3 weeks apart?
That's exactly right. 2 doses given 3 weeks apart.
Okay. And do we know anything yet about whether children 5 to 11 will eventually need boosters, or is that just something that will be evaluated?
That's going to be a wait and see. I think just like we kind of had to wait and see how this rolled out for the recommendation for boosters in those over the age of 18, we will need to wait and follow up on the immune responses in children who get the vaccine. And it's also largely going to be related to what's going on with circulation of the virus.
Right. Could we talk a little bit about children with pre-existing conditions or allergies? Are there any special considerations for this particular cohort of children?
So in terms of pre-existing conditions, there really are none that are noted to be associated with any safety concerns in terms of getting the vaccine. There have been no safety signals in terms of, if you think of the almost 9 million now 12 to 15-year-olds throughout our nation who've received a COVID-19 vaccine, there still are no safety signals that a certain underlying condition is associated with increased risk of a serious side effect from this vaccine. On the flip side, there are certainly pre-existing conditions that put individuals at higher risk of serious COVID-19 infection that should really, I think, motivate families with children with these pre-existing conditions to really be encouraged to seek COVID-19 vaccination to protect those children. Those tend to be children who are medically complex, often due to underlying either genetic or neurologic or metabolic disorders. We also know that much like has been noted in adults, some of the other underlying conditions in children that have been associated with more severe COVID-19 infection have included chronic respiratory conditions such as asthma, as well as diabetes and obesity, some immunocompromising conditions, sickle cell disease, and in some studies, children with congenital heart disease have been noted to have an increased risk of more severe COVID-19 infection. So those really are populations of children who we should really be prioritizing in particular for vaccination to protect them against a potential severe COVID-19 infection. And then when it comes to allergies, the only contraindication to getting a COVID-19 vaccine is whether someone has a known allergy or history of allergy or anaphylaxis to an ingredient in the COVID-19 vaccines, or a history of anaphylaxis to a prior COVID-19 vaccination. So beyond that, children who have food allergies or other medication allergies, there have not been any signals that those other allergies put individuals at a higher risk for having a severe allergic response to a COVID-19 vaccine. It may have implications for how long someone is monitored after they get their vaccine, but it has not been a safety signal.
Got it. So what do you say to patient families if their child has already had COVID and they said, okay, well, my child's already had COVID. Why should I also vaccinate?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I mean, we rely on natural immunity to a lot of other infections to protect us from future infections. That's very understandable, and it is true. We know from following adults and children who've had confirmed COVID-19 infection that they do get generally robust immune responses to COVID-19 after their infection. But we also know a few things about sort of the durability of that immunity as well. And some of that immunity does wane over time. We are definitely learning that from pediatric and adult studies of COVID-related immunology. We also know that not everybody's response to a COVID-19 infection is the same. So there is a fair amount of what's called heterogeneity or just variability in individuals' responses to a natural infection with COVID-19. And a number of studies have suggested that an asymptomatic infection or what was a very mild infection may be associated with less of an immune response than if someone had had a more severe infection or a more serious infection. So given that variability in immune responses to natural infection, given what we know about waning immunity following COVID-19 infection, and from some in real world studies now we have in which people with a history of known infection have gone on to be vaccinated, we know that that boosts the immunity of those individuals substantially. And we also know that vaccinating individuals with a history of COVID-19 infection is safe. So when we take all of that information together, the recommendation still falls on recommending that even with a history of COVID-19 infection, people receive a COVID-19 vaccine if they're eligible to do so. The only period of time that's recommended in terms of waiting for vaccination after a COVID-19 infection is that someone should be recovered from their COVID-19 infection, and they should have cleared the recommended period of isolation following a COVID-19 infection.
Got it. So 5 to 11, it's those are small kids that may be a little bit nervous about getting a vaccine. They've probably been hearing about it a lot. What are some of your recommendations or suggestions on how parents might be able to explain this vaccine to their small child?
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely something that families are thinking a lot about right now. I would really suggest to families that they take a very similar approach to how they've described other vaccines for their children. And a lot of that is age dependent. And then even across the ages, a lot of that is personality dependent. Every child is different. I give a lot of immunizations as a practicing pediatrician. And I can tell you that, there are some 5-year-olds who do great with vaccinations and some 11-year-olds who it's a real challenge, no matter what the vaccine is, and vice versa. So I would just encourage families, you know your child best. You know what's going to motivate them best. When it comes to talking practically about this vaccine, I would talk to them in terms of what we've all been experiencing through challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's impacted our ability to safely be in school and be with our friends and get together with family and travel, and talk about the importance of these vaccines as a major step towards us as a population being able to return to some sense of normalcy and to do so safely. So I think bringing that into whatever age appropriate sorts of discussions would be really important. That might mean just making it really specific for a child, talking about that friend that they've missed, that they haven't been able to hang out on the playground with for a while, and talking about how getting that child immunized, getting that friend immunized, all of that's going to bring us closer to being able to be back together with our friends to do things safely, being able to return to the activities or the sports that we've missed and being able to do so safely, and being able to keep the others around us safe is a really important part of that conversation as well. I think that's particularly true if families have someone in the household or someone who they like to spend time with who has an underlying condition that puts them at risk for more serious COVID-19 infection, and talking about how important it is that we do everything we can to protect those people too.
Excellent. That's a great segue into some of the next questions, which is, okay, now that my child has the vaccine, both doses, waited the 2 weeks, how how will this change or influence or change things for my child? Like, for example, birthday parties, sports, questions about wearing masks in public.
Mhm.
Can you weigh in a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, there's no one size fits all response to this question. But in general, once someone is fully vaccinated, so that does exactly as you said, Kristen, that means 2 weeks after completion of the second dose of the vaccine series, we know that they are at lower risk of becoming infected in the first place. And we know that they also are less likely to transmit this infection to others. We're still waiting on more data to really confirm the magnitude of the impact of these vaccines on spreading to others, but there does certainly seem to be some protection against transmission as well from these vaccines. And most importantly, we know that these vaccines are highly effective at preventing severe COVID-19 infections that lead to hospitalizations and some even to death. So taking all of that into consideration, once someone is fully vaccinated, the CDC website, for example, has done a very good job keeping up to date with what changes for someone when they're fully vaccinated in terms of what they can feel safe doing, what they should be thinking about in terms of masking. But a vaccination status is not the only factor that should go into that decision. So exactly as you suggested, Kristen, the consideration should also be what kind of people are you thinking about spending time with, or what kind of people would you be in close contact with, especially if it's going to be indoors. And what kind of exposures are you and your family having? What is going on with community transmission at that point in time? If you have a fully vaccinated 5 to 11-year-old and you live in a community where transmission has been in the low range of transmission, or your family has really not had much by way of exposures, everyone has been taking precautions to really minimize those exposures, then I think getting together indoors with other vaccinated children that meet similar criteria could be considered safe. I'm still thinking about when I am going into indoor settings right now, based on what's happening with transmission in Massachusetts, for example, about putting a mask on when I'm going into indoor settings, and I'll be with people whose own vaccination status I'm not privy to, especially if those are crowded settings, or if those settings are going to put me into close contact with others for a prolonged period of time. I'm still feeling most comfortable doing so wearing a mask. So families will still be having some of those conversations, but they do absolutely have an added layer of safety once their children are fully vaccinated.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. So we received a lot of questions. There was a lot of questions that were submitted in advance for this webinar. And so let's just dive right in, because
Sure.
I feel like we have seen a lot of these questions repeatedly over the course of the last couple of months. So a lot of people say that kids do not get seriously ill from COVID-19. So why would I take the chance by giving my child a vaccine that I don't think they really need? There's also a great deal of misinformation that's been floating around online that has been telling families that, more kids have died of the flu last year than COVID. Can you share some of the most recent stats on COVID in kids that you have available?
Sure, yeah. I'll share what is freshest in my memory and what I trust is accurate, because it was reviewed again at the FDA committee meeting that led to the authorization of this vaccine. So for the 5 to 11-year-old age group, we know there have been over 1.9 million cases of COVID-19. So that's confirmed infection. That number is actually probably much higher, because indeed, young children do tend to have more mild and sometimes even asymptomatic infection from COVID-19. So it may even be as high as 10 million cases in this age range, or perhaps even more. And then within those numbers, we know that there were over 8,000 hospitalizations in 5 to 11-year-olds for COVID-19 infection. And we know that a third of those occurred in otherwise healthy individuals. Beyond that, we also heard the number that was reported during that briefing was that there were 143 COVID-related fatalities in the 5 to 11 age range to the date of when those data were being reviewed. We also know that there have been over 5,200 confirmed cases of the serious inflammatory condition that can follow a COVID-19 infection called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or MISC. And we know that this age range actually has so far accounted for the majority of cases of MISC. So those are really the numbers that we know of so far, the numbers that have been confirmed so far through the best available data. So I would say that those are not insignificant numbers. Indeed, compared to the percent of hospitalizations or fatalities in older individuals, those sound like very small numbers. But to any family who has had a child who suffered from MISC or required hospitalization for COVID-19, or certainly for a family who lost a child to COVID-19, those numbers, those are real numbers. And when we think about it in comparison to something that I think we all just feel like we have more experience with, such as influenza, those actually are very similar numbers to what we see for influenza in what would be considered a relatively bad flu season. Mm-hmm. And the comment about more children dying from flu last year than COVID-19 is simply not true. There are very well curated data around influenza pediatric mortalities on the CDC website. And in the 2020-21 season, there was one pediatric mortality from influenza. And if we even look back historically at our influenza seasons over the last several years, we typically see somewhere on the order of maybe 100 to 150 pediatric mortalities from influenza during an average flu season. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, that the 2009-2010 H1N1 pandemic hit children particularly hard, and we had 288 pediatric mortalities from influenza during the H1N1 pandemic season. So to give people some frame of reference for those numbers, we're not talking about for pediatric severe illnesses and pediatric mortalities, we're not talking about small numbers. When we think historically in the context of vaccinations that have been incredibly successful, mm-hmm. We think about Haemophilus influenza type B, for example, a bacterial infection that before we had effective immunization killed 1,000 children every year, sometimes over 1,000, and they tended to be infants. And maybe in the grand scale of things, those numbers, especially if we were thinking about them in the context of how many adults, for example, have died from COVID-19, maybe that doesn't sound like a large number of children either. But we were fortunate enough for science to advance us to effective immunization against Haemophilus influenza type B. For decades now, it's been part of the routine immunization series, and we now see very few cases even, and even fewer fatalities, certainly, from Haemophilus influenza type B infection. And that's just one type of infection. I could list so many other infections that we've been fortunate enough to have science advance us to safe and effective vaccines to protect our children against. And that really gets to what it takes to be able to keep kids healthy. Children shouldn't be dying from infection. None of them should be. So historically, when we have had a vaccine that's been shown to be safe and effective, it's something that pediatricians broadly have gone forward with recommending and encouraging their families to take part in.
Absolutely. We are also hearing direct concerns from parents when they ask about the studies that went into this vaccine. Some of the comments are, it feels rushed. Some use words like experimental. Can you talk a little bit about what the studies tell us?
Sure. Yeah, so I can appreciate the sense that the progress of COVID-19 vaccination has felt rushed, but I think that's for a few reasons. First of all, the advancement of all of the available COVID-19 vaccines was much faster than it has been historically for any other vaccine effort. And that is because of the global scale of this pandemic and how it was affecting our world, and because of an unbelievable global multinational commitment to the resources and the research and the efforts that would go into moving a vaccine into clinical trials once it was shown to be safe, and then moving it forward and implementing it and making it broadly available once well-controlled studies that met all of the safety criteria that have always been in place for all other medications and vaccines continue to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. And that is exactly the pathway that these vaccines have taken. It did happen at a pace that is unprecedented because the effort, the collective scientific sort of groupthink that went into these vaccines was truly unprecedented. mRNA vaccinology was not brand new. It has actually been under study for over a decade. And actually the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic really just provided an unbelievably important and critical use and utility of that technology. But that technology has been under study for vaccination against illnesses for quite some time. So I don't totally know how to respond to the word experimental. I think, you know, at some point, every medication, every vaccine started in science, and there's a process. There is a very well-defined process to bring any discovery forward from being exactly that, a discovery, to being something that has been shown to be safe and effective in humans. And the COVID-19 vaccines followed those processes really to a T. So there are now hundreds of millions of people who've received these vaccines. Because this is relatively newer technology, though, incredible investments have been put into ongoing surveillance for any safety signals from these vaccines, more so than has been undertaken for any other vaccine or medication rollout, frankly, in the history of new vaccines and medications. And all of that safety surveillance continues to tell us that these vaccines have a very favorable safety profile. So that surveillance will continue to be ongoing. It will continue to be very robust surveillance for any safety concerns in the 5 to 11-year-olds. And I trust in this process. And as a parent myself of children who became eligible for vaccination, I was very excited to see the data. I was very excited to understand how carefully safety was considered for children. And I was very excited to be able to get them the important protection that they'll get from vaccination.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And there is another question a parent has submitted that talks a little bit about reading about the vaccine impacting my child's growth, and also talking a little bit about fertility issues. Can you speak directly to this parent as a parent yourself and share your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I would start by thinking about any of us as parents. We want to make sure that, first of all, anything that we are exposing our children to is not going to do them harm. That is fundamentally understandable as a parent. And in terms of really thinking about what we know about vaccines and how they work, based on how these vaccines work, based on the scientific understanding of exactly how they generate an immune response, based on the scientific understanding of what happens to the mRNA once it's injected, which is that it essentially breaks down completely and is not even detectable anywhere in the body within really a fairly short time, within a day, frankly, after vaccination. And based on what we know about the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein and any similarity it might have to other proteins that humans make, there is truly no scientific plausible reason to be concerned that these vaccines would impact fertility or growth. And then beyond that, we now have, as I said, almost 9 million 12 to 15-year-olds who've been receiving these vaccines, who've been vaccinated, and that's been ongoing in the US since May of this year. We continue to have no safety signals that are showing up as part of the robust surveillance for the safety of these vaccines. And again, all of this will continue to be monitored, but there is no evidence to date that these vaccines will have any impact on growth or fertility.
Great. Can we talk a little bit about children? We see a lot of complex, patients here at Boston Children's. Can we talk a little bit about children with pre-existing heart conditions? What, if any, effect the vaccine would have with children who have pre-existing heart conditions?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I am in touch a lot with a lot of our cardiology colleagues who care for that population as well. There have been no safety concerns in children with underlying heart conditions or congenital heart disease in terms of the safety of these vaccines. So these vaccines continue to show themselves to be safe in children with a number of underlying conditions, including children with underlying heart conditions. And then on the other side of that, so that's the safety side of things. On the other side of that, we have the benefit. So we're always thinking about risk and benefit. So on the benefit side of things, it also is true that children with underlying heart conditions, some congenital heart diseases, or other underlying heart conditions may even have more benefit from these vaccines, because some studies have shown that congenital heart disease and certain congenital heart lesions can be have perhaps been associated with a higher risk of more severe COVID-19 infection. So I would encourage anyone, if they have specific questions about their child's underlying medical condition, to review that with their pediatrician or their child specialist. But broadly speaking, in terms of underlying heart disease, that's where we stand.
Got it. There are a number of questions from parents regarding their child has had COVID. You mentioned at the top a little bit about that waiting period of before they can get vaccinated. So what does that waiting period look like? For example, if your child had, a positive COVID test, let's say October 1st, what are some of the things that families need to look for, or what boxes do they need to check before they can schedule that appointment?
Yeah, so the only required interval in terms of waiting before getting a vaccine for someone who has had a documented COVID-19 infection is that that individual is recovered from their COVID-19 infection and that they have cleared their isolation period. So that isolation period typically is 10 days after symptom onset, or 10 days after a positive test in someone who didn't develop symptoms. So that's the only requirement, really. What we know on the flip side in terms of safety data is that this vaccine has shown to be safe in people with a history of naturally occurring COVID-19 infection. We know from studies of antibodies that Pfizer did for the 5 to 11-year-olds that participated in their trial, that almost 9% of them, if I'm recalling from their review, almost 9% of them had evidence from antibody studies of having had a prior COVID-19 infection. And when they did a subset look at those children, there were no safety concerns. And they're also, they showed very, very good immune responses to the vaccine. Indeed, actually having had a COVID-19 infection, somebody maybe getting, it still sort of remains to be studied, but even higher immune responses to vaccination, because they've seen the pathogen before, and then the vaccine comes along and is already sort of boosting the immunity that they got. So I would say both then, on the safety side, I think we feel very comfortable about this vaccine in people with a history of infection. And then we also know that the only stated interval would be that they have recovered from their infection and cleared their isolation period.
Got it. Here's another question that sort of piggybacks a little bit on that is there any certain time period between giving your child the flu shot and getting the COVID vaccine. My daughter just got the flu shot yesterday. She had already had her COVID vaccine. She's in a different category, but whereas a lot of kids now are getting the flu shot, is there a specific time frame that they should wait to get both, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, so we know, so I'll start again. We're always thinking about things in terms of risk, and that comes into safety. Are there any safety concerns about kids getting at the same time? And then there's benefits. So are there any reasons that we would worry that you might not get as much benefit from getting both vaccines at the same time? And I would say that we feel very comfortable. I certainly feel very comfortable saying that children can get the flu shot and a COVID vaccine at the same time. I think that's especially important for families for whom getting your child into a vaccine clinic, into a appointment with your pediatrician's office to get vaccines, for so many of us, like that's a big challenge, and it can involve sometimes finding childcare, taking time out of work. And so I would say that if someone is in that scenario, I think families can feel very comfortable having their child receive both vaccines at the same time. And the reasons for that are that we, first of all, have been doing simultaneous COVID-19 vaccines and flu shots in older individuals for over a month now, since the flu vaccine campaign began in the US. We additionally have decades of experience giving children in particular multiple vaccines at the same time, knowing that they're still safe. It's still safe to give multiple vaccines at the same time, and that the vaccines are still effective when given at the same time. And that has been the case for the routine immunization series that children have been receiving for decades. And then additionally, specific to controlled studies of getting a COVID shot and a flu shot at the same time, we do have some data out of a study that was undertaken in the UK. It was with adults, but there were adults who received their second dose of the COVID vaccine, including the Pfizer vaccine, in one arm, and then either a dose of the flu shot or a placebo vaccine in the other arm. And then they followed those individuals to look for a change in side effects or any safety concerns, and to also look at their immune responses to both vaccines. And in summary, there was no difference in side effects for the people who received the COVID shot with the placebo versus the COVID shot with the flu shot. And additionally, the immune responses to both vaccines when given at the same time were very similar to the immune responses when they were given separately. So I think we can feel very confident saying that children could receive a COVID shot and a flu shot at the same time.
Wonderful. Terrific. Question about the holidays are coming up. And parent writes in, my kids will be fully vaccinated before Christmas. Can we host our family? And if so, is it okay to invite family members who are unvaccinated or the status is questionable?
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I feel like we, this pandemic has moved us all into having a lot of conversations with our families, some welcome conversations, and some a little bit more fraught with anxiety. That's very understandable, very relatable. I think, again, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all response to this question. I think certainly having people come together, especially for indoor gatherings, which, you know, here, if we're talking New England, it's likely to be indoor come Christmas time, or Thanksgiving time. But I think that, again, people have to consider their specific scenario. Certainly having fully vaccinated individuals together indoors is safer than unvaccinated people, or a mix of vaccinated and unvaccinated people being together. But then I think too, people need to take into consideration their own household circumstances, their family circumstances, and the circumstances for those that they are considering hosting. So I think that families should still be thinking about, where are the other individuals coming from? What is community-wide transmission like in the community where you're going to be gathering, and in the community where people are coming from? What kinds of exposures do the people who you plan on hosting have on a regular basis? Are they trying to limit those exposures by wearing masks when they're indoors? And that's especially important if they're unvaccinated. So I still think families have to do some of those calculations, and maybe have some of those difficult conversations to make a decision that's best for their family. But yes, in general, having fully vaccinated 5 to 11-year-olds, fully vaccinated other family members and friends, that would be gathering together that would be safer than with unvaccinated individuals.
Got it. Okay, so we're going to move, and we've been sort of shifting into the live Q&A over the last couple of minutes. So we're going to go ahead and start going there. If we can't get to all of these questions, please check back on our COVID-19 answer site, and we update it really frequently. I would also suggest our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter on social media. We are also sharing a lot of information and content there as well. So there's been some questions around, one dose, and some families feeling like, does the first dose offer enough protection for my 5 to 11-year-old? Can you talk a little bit about why that second dose is important 3 weeks later?
Sure, yeah. So what we know about a single dose compared to completion of the series, especially in 5 to 11-year-olds, that largely comes from the data that came from the phase 3 trial.
Mm-hmm.
So if you looked at the immune responses in children after their first dose compared to their immune responses after their second dose, there was clearly substantial boosting of that immune response that was afforded by the second dose. So taking that together with what we are starting to understand about either vaccine or natural infection generated immunity, we still don't have a perfect, what's called a correlate of immunity, which really refers to a measurable response, typically a measurable response in the blood, such as antibody response that we know is associated with protection against infection. We still don't quite have that exact correlate of immunity very clearly defined. But at least the data now from very, very large populations of individuals who've had either natural infection or vaccine-mediated infection suggests that having an antibody titer over a certain level is much more likely to be associated with certainly protection against severe COVID-19 infection and maybe protection from infection at all. So I would say that knowing that then and knowing that as was not too unexpected in the 5 to 11-year-old trials, antibody responses were much higher after the second dose than the first dose, that is largely why the 2-dose series is what's recommended.
Got it. That makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about, have you heard anything regarding, the Moderna vaccine for this particular age group? There's been a couple of questions of folks asking.
Sure, yeah. The Moderna vaccine for this age group, as some in this group may know, Moderna actually completed their trials in 12 to 17-year-olds, and they submitted that data, I think it was even over the summer, back in June, to the FDA for review and for consideration for emergency use authorization. We're still waiting to hear the FDA response on that. Again, in younger individuals in particular, and I think especially in that 12 to 17-year age range, because of the concern for, albeit rare, but because of the concern for associated myocarditis,
Mm-hmm.
the FDA is just being really, they're meticulously reviewing that data in 12 to 17-year-olds and probably having some conversations with Moderna about where it lands in terms of the risk and benefit assessments that are being undertaken. And we don't really know too much more than what Moderna announced from their press release about
Mm-hmm.
those findings, that indeed the vaccine appeared to elicit very robust antibody responses in that age range. But the data have not been more fully made available than that. So we're all eagerly awaiting that. But it is something that I might expect us to hear a little bit more about from the FDA in the coming couple of months. And then beyond that, we know Moderna is also completing trials in younger children. And they also had a press release describing their trial data in 6 to 11-year-olds. Again, it's at the level of press release data. So they described it as being immunogenic, meaning that it elicited good antibody responses. They described it as having a favorable safety profile. Again, I think the dose in that age range for Moderna was lower than the dose used in older individuals. So I think we're all expecting to hear more about that soon. I've not heard officially that Moderna has submitted the 6 to 11-year-old data to the FDA, but we would expect that soon. So I think more to come on that, but there are certainly other vaccines in the works for this age range.
Terrific. We have a question. My 5-year-old son had brain surgery for seizure control last year. Any data on children with a history of epilepsy who've received the vaccine?
It's a good question. I did not see a breakdown in the FDA review of the data about underlying conditions. We do know that there was a description of children with underlying conditions, and then they don't give a ton of detail about what those underlying conditions are. We know a number of those children had asthma. We know a number of those children also were obese, but there's no reason to suspect that there would be a safety concern for children in the 5 to 11-year age range with a seizure disorder, based on what we know now from the much larger vaccination experience in older children and adolescents. Children with underlying seizure disorders, there have not been safety signals of the vaccination posing any sort of an increased risk to those children. And then again, on the flip side of that, I would say that there is evidence that individuals, including children with underlying neurologic conditions, can be at risk for more severe COVID-19 infection. So again, pointing to maybe even more reason to encourage vaccination or seek vaccination for those children. So again, I encourage everyone to review their child's specific condition if they have specific questions about the vaccine based on their child's specific condition with their pediatrician or their specialist, but that's where the data stands so far.
Got it. A question, is that 90% efficacy against all the current variants, including Delta?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the timing of this really included children who'd completed the vaccination series as per when the trial was running. And so that really was from June forward. So not only would we have expected that to all be Delta, but the FDA review, the Pfizer representative did describe that of the, I think it was 19 cases that were confirmed in the 5 to 11-year-old children, 14 had been sequenced and all confirmed as Delta. So not only were they all expected to be Delta based on the timing of those infections, but all with sequence data available so far were Delta. So that actually, you could even say that efficacy points almost exclusively to anti-Delta.
Got it. A question about the vaccine and patients that have celiac disease. Are there any concerns about receiving the vaccine if you have celiac?
Again, so celiac disease has not been one that so far has triggered any sort of safety concerns or differences in the safety profile. So again, I don't want to keep giving the same answer, but I might just check with your child's pediatrician or specialist if there's something specific about their condition, but that has not been revealed from the surveillance, post-authorization surveillance data available so far to be of concern.
Got it. Here's a question. My son has currently has a little cold, little running nose, no fever, already a negative COVID test. Will it be okay for my son to have the vaccine tomorrow?
It's a good question. There's not a safety reason to not do it tomorrow. I would say if your child is having fever with the respiratory infection that he's experiencing now, maybe worth holding off just because, you know, we know a small percentage of children did get fever from this vaccine. So could it make the fever worse? Or more likely, could it just become confusing then to try and disentangle whether he's having side effects from the vaccine or side effects from the respiratory infection that you know he already had. But I would check with your pediatrician's office or wherever it is that you're going to be getting that vaccine and make sure it's still okay. But there's not a clear safety or immunologic reason, again, if it's just very mild congestion and upper respiratory symptoms to not do it tomorrow.
Absolutely. Do you recommend, you know, a child getting the vaccine at Boston Children's Hospital? I know we have a pretty big clinic going versus like a CVS or a clinic. You know, is there any recommendation from you on where they should get the vaccine?
Yeah, again, I think that this really should be based on your best understanding of your child and how he or she is going to do in any one of those settings.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know that your child has a really hard time with vaccines, and that is the most comfortable setting might be your pediatrician's office, or if your pediatrician's office isn't offering the vaccines, maybe in a community-based clinic where your child might know someone. Maybe in that setting, maybe, sitting in a CVS or a Walgreens is not going to be the easiest for your child. Or maybe you know your child and you know that kind of like a quiet environment might even be best for your child.
Mm-hmm.
My own experience through bringing one of my children through a commercial pharmacy setting was that, it was in a back room, it was relatively quiet. And so you can kind of look into what those settings are each going to be,
Mm-hmm.
And think about what is going to work best for your child. Certainly here at Children's, it will be a very busy vaccine clinic. But there's been a lot of care taken into how that vaccine clinic is going to run, into people being able to be well distanced, and people will certainly be getting their vaccines from people who care almost exclusively for children, and know how to help children maybe walk through the vaccine process. So I think about those details as well in terms of who'd be giving the vaccines and what's going to be best for your child.
Great. Here's a really good question, and I think it's important for everyone to hear. What's recommended for kids that are on the cusp of turning 12?
Mm-hmm.
Should they begin with this lower dose and then for their second dose get the adult, or wait?
Mm-hmm.
The question then is, should you really just stick with the dosing or the version of
Mm-hmm.
that vaccine for the second dose if you're changing ages, let's say?
Yeah. So I can tell you that here at Children's, for example, in our vaccine clinic, and I suspect this will be the case in the commercial pharmacies as well, the vaccines are only going to be given as authorized by age. So if an 11-year-old came in tomorrow for a vaccine, they're going to get the 10 microgram dose. If they subsequently turn 12 in the interim 3 weeks and come back for their second dose, they'll get the 30 microgram dose. And that's really because it's the age-based authorization for these vaccines so far. And having given the authorized age-based vaccine is what we will be able to contribute towards documenting their vaccination and achieving their fully vaccinated status. So that's the approach we're taking here. There was specific comment to this in the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices meeting, that if in this scenario, a child, for example, at a pediatrician's office in that exact same scenario started with a 10 microgram dose and then subsequently turned 12, but still got the 10 microgram dose, that would not be counted as a vaccine error. Under any other circumstances, not having received the age-specific authorized dose would have to be documented as a vaccine error and would be reported. And they specifically commented that would not be considered error. And again, in terms of thinking back about, I'm always thinking about safety and immune responses, which we can use as sort of a substitute for efficacy. There is certainly no reason for concern for safety of either of those combinations of doing the 2-dose series. And we would also expect both of those to still be associated with very good immune responses. So.
Got it. And then one last question. It's again regarding the study. You mentioned at the top there were a couple of thousand kids that participated in the 5 to 11 study. Could you just reiterate again that many different sizes and weights and different medical backgrounds? Could you just talk a little bit about that? There's a lot of questions around sizes, underweight, overweight.
Yeah, so I mean, there were no weight restrictions for families who were enrolling in that study. I did not see a breakdown in the Pfizer presentation to the FDA based on weight of the immune responses, but one thing they did show was a comparison of if they just looked at the 10 to 11-year-olds who participated in their study, and they compared those just to the 5 to 6-year-olds, for example, and then they compared those to 16 to 25-year-olds who were part of their phase 3 study with the 30 microgram doses. those immune responses after dose 2 were all very, very similar. And you could imagine that there were very different weights. The average weight in the 5 to 6 year olds that made up that data probably were very different than in the 10 to 11 year olds. And that was probably very different than in the 16 to 25 year olds who received that higher dose. So I think, to me, that at least spoke to what we know about vaccines, which is that they really don't need to be weight-based. And that the age-based difference is one that was still associated with very consistent and strong immune responses. And additionally, there was no difference in the safety profile in those two extremes of ages that were included in this study too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much,
Sure.
Dr. Moffitt. I really appreciate it. This was such an informative hour. We just, can't thank you enough. For more questions about COVID-19, please reach out to our dedicated hotline. You can find that information available at bostonchildrens.org. You can also visit our dedicated vaccine page that has a ton of information at bostonchildrens.org/COVID vaccine. And you'll find a lot of links and videos and parenting resources as well. So thank you so very much, everybody. Again, check back on our social media for other answers to your questions, and have a great afternoon.